Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really dense review for you today. But before we get into the weeds, I need to ask you a quick favor. Subscribe and hit the thumbs up. It really helps this format.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And we are doing academic quality here, but in a form that can be listened to normally.
Exactly. This is SIC News, the weekly review from the world of philosophy.
And just to set our parameters for you, this episode covers the week of February 1926, 2026.
Right. So let's map out the agenda. We have broken this deep dive into 5 main segments. First up, we are looking at the academy and the infrastructure of debate.
Institutional side of things, yeah.
Yeah. Segment 2 is all about publications and the signals we are getting from major platforms.
Which is where we see the actual concepts crystallizing.
Right. Then segment 3, we are diving into religion and theology as philosophy. So looking at disputes on truth and authority and conscience.
A really fascinating angle this week.
It is. And then segment 4, this is the big synthesis. We are going to look at AI trust models and what we are calling the crisis of testimony.
The crisis of the witness.
Yes.
But finally, segment 5. We will leave you with the 3 questions of the week.
So a lot of ground to cover.
Let's just jump right in. Segment 1, the academy and the infrastructure of debate. We are talking specifically about the APA Central Meeting.
Right, so the American Philosophical Association Central Division meeting, this happened February 19th through the 21st.
And for those of you who might not track academic conferences, this is, it's basically the trade show for philosophy.
Yeah, it's where the discipline decides what actually matters. And the agenda this year was heavily weighted toward artificial intelligence education and this concept of epistemic trust.
So sessions on large language models and deepfakes. AI in didactics. Which is interesting because normally you expect philosophy to be a bit slower, a bit more insulated.
Well, this is exactly where the sociology of knowledge comes into play. You see, philosophy stabilizes its pluralism through these institutional formats.
So what the institution puts on the schedule, it dictates what is considered valid philosophy. The infrastructure isn't neutral. It literally decides what counts as an epical theme versus what is just a peripheral issue.
By putting deepfakes on the main stage, they are defining the battlefield.
Exactly. They are saying to the academic world that trust in machine outputs is no longer an engineering problem. It is the fundamental philosophical problem of 2026.
Because if we can't define reality anymore, then all the other philosophical debates just sort of collapse.
Right, that's the underlying dread here, yes.
Which perfectly transitions us to the Dewey lecture that was delivered on the 19th. The title was, "Is Formalism Ruining Epistemology?"
A phenomenal lecture. And the core question it posed is whether our formal tools are actually destroying our epistemic content.
Break that down for us, because formalism can sound like just a dry academic term.
Right. So formalism in this context is the reliance on mathematical logic, on probability calculus, on strict rule-based systems to explain how we know things.
Like trying to turn human thought into an equation.
Exactly. And the lecture argued that this obsession with formal elegance is masking a severe phenomenological poverty.
Phenomenological poverty. That is such a dark concept.
It really is. It means a system can be logically flawless, perfectly consistent, but completely empty of actual human experience.
So it's mathematically true, but experientially dead.
Yes. Think of an AI that writes a perfectly structured logical proof about human suffering without ever having the capacity to suffer. It's consistent, but empty. The lecture is a dispute about what constitutes actual proof in our era.
And you can see how that ties right back to the APA's focus on deepfakes.
Yeah.
If we only value the formal output, the image, the text, the audio, we lose the reality of the human subject behind it.
We lose the anchor. And speaking of losing the anchor, we saw this tension again on February 21st at a book launch.
Right, the session on Stephen J. White. They launched the volume responsibility and the demands of morality.
And this is how conferences work as vehicles for canonization.
Yeah.
An idea moves from a loose debate into a bound volume. It becomes canon.
But why this specific book right now? Why is responsibility the hot topic?
Because the concept of responsibility in 2026 is evaporating. We have a complete blurring of agency across normative ethics and law and technology.
Because of the models. Because if an algorithm makes a fatal error, who is morally responsible? The coder, the data set, the end user.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
philosophy is frantically trying to build a conceptual net to catch this dissolving sense of agency. The traditional boundaries of who did what are gone.
It's terrifying, honestly. You look at all these institutional moves, the APA agenda, the Dewey lecture, the book launches, and you realize something profound. When the infrastructure of debate changes, the definition of truth changes with it.
It's a structural shift. The container is changing, so the substance inside has to change too.
Which brings us to segment 2. Let's look at the publications. What is actually crystallizing out there in the literature and the platforms?
We have some major signals here, starting with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the SEP.
Always a bellwether for where the field is at.
Well, absolutely. On February 19th, there was a substantive revision of their entry on computer simulations in science.
Okay, so why is a revision of an encyclopedia entry so crucial for this week's deep dive?
Because of the two fundamental problems simulations pose: opacity and validation.
Opacity meaning we can't see inside the black box.
Precisely. For the listener, opacity means we are increasingly using tools that give us answers, but we cannot trace how they arrived at those answers. The inferential steps are hidden.
We just feed in the data and accept the output.
Right. And philosophy of science is violently reacting to this world of models. The SEP revision is providing the vocabulary we need to discuss our trust in these models without fetishizing their results.
Because if we don't have that vocabulary, we just become a society that blindly obeys the oracle. We obey the machine output.
Which is intellectually fatal. You can't have a scientific method if you can't validate the intermediate steps.
And keeping with that theme of models, there was a preprint accepted to the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science on February 25th.
Ah, yes, the de-idealization paper.
Right. It proposes a practical typology of de-idealization: intramodel, intermodel, and measurement.
It sounds dense, but the conceptual stake here is basically how we bridge the gap between pure theory and messy reality.
Right, because scientific models are inherently idealized.
They have to be. You assume a frictionless vacuum to make the math work. But this paper is pushing away from those ideal theories and looking at actual scientific practice.
How do we justify these models when they touch the real world?
Exactly. Where does the pure math end and the physical chaos begin? We are constantly asking models to describe reality, but we rarely analyze the friction between the model and the world.
And if we don't understand that friction, we end up trusting a map that doesn't match the territory.
Which is a profound epistemic failure.
Moving on to February 19th, we saw a fascinating essay in metaphilosophy titled Philosophical Facts.
This one is a fight for the very survival of the discipline. It argues that philosophy does in fact have a large pool of basic facts and real expertise.
Which counters the popular joke that philosophy never makes any progress.
Right, the idea that we are just debating the same Greek texts for 2,000 years. This essay argues forcefully that we do accumulate facts. They just aren't always empirical facts.
They are structural facts, conceptual constraints.
Exactly. But the author asks a sharp question. Must our consensus always be on media-friendly topics like the Chinese room or philosophical zombies to count as progress?
Or can progress just be the slow, quiet mapping of logical necessity?
Yes. It's defending the rigor of the field in an age that demands instant, easily digestible data.
And finally, for segment 2, we have an open access article published on February 25th about Jan Patoča.
A heavy but necessary inclusion. It analyzes Patoča's genealogy of freedom, his negative Platonism and responsibility.
And referencing his involvement with Charter 77.
Which is key. Patoča wasn't just theorizing in a vacuum. He was interrogated by the secret police and died shortly after. For him, freedom wasn't a political slogan.
There's a structure of experience.
A structure that demands responsibility. It completely fits our dark theme this week, the resistance against oppressive structures.
Whether that structure is a totalitarian government in the 1970s or an opaque algorithmic model dictating reality in 2026.
The underlying philosophical demand is the same. Freedom requires a conscious, responsible agent. The models want to alleviate us of that burden.
And Patoča reminds us that giving up that burden is giving up our humanity.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift to segment 3. Religion and theology as philosophy.
This is an area people often overlook when discussing tech and epistemology. But the disputes here are foundational. They are disputes about truth, authority, and conscience.
Absolutely. And on February 19th, we had a massive signal from the Vatican, the Pope's warning on AI.
Yes. In a speech to clergy, he explicitly warned against using AI to prepare homilies.
Now, on the surface, someone might say, well, of course, the church is just protecting its traditions. But there is a deep philosophical stance here.
It is entirely an epistemological stance. The Pope stated that AI cannot share faith and that reason requires exercise.
Because a homily isn't just a document.
Exactly. A homily is a relation. It is a relational event between a person and a community. It's not data transmission.
So if you use a large language model to write a beautiful, mathematically perfect sermon,
You have hollowed out the entire event. The boundary of the subject is at stake here. Can religious truth be reduced to mere information?
if the AI feigns the form of the sermon, it essentially kills the witness. The person standing there has risked nothing. They have exercised no reason, no conscience.
It's the phenomenological poverty we talked about in the Dewey lecture, but applied to the soul. The form is perfect, but the content is dead.
That is deeply unsettling, and it leads right into the next publication on our radar. From Oxford University Press, also on February 19th, The Final Word, Al-Dawani and the Liar Paradox in the Islamic World.
This is a brilliant historical piece. We all know the liar paradox from basic logic classes, right? This sentence is false.
Right, a semantic brain teaser.
But this book shows how, in the Islamic tradition, that classic paradox functioned as a theological weapon.
A weapon in what sense?
In the sense that logic is not neutral. Logic in these historical disputes was used to police the boundaries of what could be legally and theological said about God, about truth itself.
So it wasn't just abstract math, it was about authority. Who gets to define the limits of truth and falsehood?
Exactly. When you define the rules of logic, you are defining the architecture of reality. And if you control that architecture, you hold immense theological power.
Which is a perfect segue to the final book in this segment, published on February 26th. One God, One System, a book on Sanskrit philosophy.
Specifically, it's reconstructing the history of Vedanta philosophy without relying on an agreed-upon canon.
Which challenges how we even map philosophy.
Right, because the history of philosophy is essentially a negotiation of what questions matter. When you globalize the canon and look at traditions without a rigid central text, you change the entire map of fundamental ontology.
You realize that the questions we thought were universal might just be regional.
And that the definition of reality is always a negotiated settlement.
Okay, take a breath, because we are moving into segment 4. This is the synthesis of everything we've been circling. AI, trust, models, the crisis of testimony.
This is the focal point of the week.
So let's pull the threads together. We have the APA sessions fretting over deepfakes. We have the SIC revising how we validate opaque simulations. And we have that essay from February 20th about moral scaffolding and social ecology.
When you synthesize those facts, you get a singular, terrifying tension. Deepfakes are destroying our social perception, and large language models are complicating the very nature of authorship.
We used to ask, is this sentence true?
Right, that was the standard epistemic check. Semantics.
Now we must ask, who is the authorized witness?
Because it's a complete shift from semantics to practical epistemology.
Exactly. If the model is opaque like the SIC says, and the output is a hallucination like a deepfake, the only anchor left is the authority of the source.
But the source is dissolving into the algorithm.
That is the crisis of testimony. We have no witness.
Think about it. If you see a video of a political event, in the past you asked, is the camera angle deceptive? But you knew the event occurred. Now, the event itself might be statistically generated noise.
It's an ontological void. There is no human subject who can stand up and say, I testify that this happened.
The machine doesn't testify, it just predicts the next pixel. It predicts the next word.
And yet we are filtering our entire civilization through these models.
Which means philosophy is no longer just an academic pursuit. It is the discipline guarding the transition from tool to truth claim.
We are the ones having to say, wait, just because the model generated this incredibly coherent output does not grant it the authority of a witness.
Because if we surrender that authority to the model, we surrender our grip on reality entirely. We become trapped in a phenomenologically empty loop.
The crisis of testimony really is the defining anxiety of this moment. Which brings us to our final segment. Segment 5, the 3 questions of the week.
These are the unresolved tensions you should be sitting with.
Question 1, deriving directly from the testimony crisis. If AI generates a formally correct argument, what else must it possess to be considered a credible cognitive witness?
It forces us to ask if logic is enough. Or does a witness require skin in the game, a capacity to suffer the consequences of being wrong?
Question 2, looking back at the academy, when does control over a syllabus, as seen in the public debate this week, become control over the conditions of truth?
Right, because defining what is peripheral and what is epical isn't just administration, it's epistemic engineering. It shapes what the next generation can even perceive as real.
And question 3, moving from the Hesed to reality. If science and AI live within models, does philosophical responsibility today lie in describing the world, or in describing the procedures that allow models to claim they describe the world?
That is the ultimate shift in our discipline. We're no longer observing nature. We are auditing the black boxes that observe nature for us.
We are auditing the matrix.
We have to, because no one else has the vocabulary to do it.
That was the week where authority and truth collided with technology and institutional control.
In a world of models, the question isn't just what you think, but on what basis you're allowed to think it.
This was SIC, News, the weekly review from the world of philosophy. Thanks for listening, and hear you next week.